The Apostle Paul taught that the goal at which the Torah aims is the Messiah. And he also said that the things of Torah are a shadow of things that are coming, but the body is of the Messiah. The Torah is supposed to teach us about and lead us to the Messiah. In last week's and this week's Torah portion, we learned about all of the different components of the tabernacle. But how do they teach us about and lead us to Messiah? Well, firstly, in chapter 25, we read about the Ark of the Covenant. As we discussed 2 weeks ago, sometimes God would meet the people where they were at, both accommodating their cultural expectations while at the same time elevating them, moving them towards his ideals. And in the case of the Ark, since God was invisible and he forbade the people from making an idol to represent him, the Ark could be understood as a focal point of the sanctuary, serving kind of a similar function as an idol without actually crossing over into idolatry. The Ark was understood to represent God, to represent him on his throne, the place from which God would speak to the people. And like a king sitting on a throne, God transmitted his commandments from this position. And even in the ark were placed the tablets containing the 10 Commandments. Furthermore, the golden covering of the ark is called the mercy seat, which not only literally covered the ark, but was also sprinkled with blood on the Day of Atonement, representing the atonement that covered the people's sins each year. And all of this imagery reminds us of Jesus, because Jesus is like the ark, because he is the medium that God uses to come down and speak to us. Through Jesus, God speaks to us. And what does God say through Jesus? Well, the same things he spoke through the ark, his commandments. In fact, just as the commandments of God were placed in the ark, the Torah was placed on the heart of Jesus. Jesus perfectly lived out God's commandments. And furthermore, just as the covering of the ark represented the atonement that Israel would receive every year, it is through Jesus that we receive ultimate and eternal atonement. Also in chapter 25, we read about how God instructed them to build a table on which would be placed the bread of the presence. And we learn from elsewhere in the Torah that the priests were to bake 12 loaves of bread each week and place them on the table. The 12 loaves represented the people of Israel and the covenant between them and God. Throughout each week, the bread would constantly be before God's presence, teaching us how important it is for God's people to be near to God. And furthermore, on the Sabbath, in God's presence, the priests would eat the bread, essentially sharing a meal with him. Eating bread together was an ancient way of expressing that you were in covenant relationship. So it's no surprise that Jesus compares being in relationship with him with the eating of bread, since our relationship with Jesus is what signifies that we are in covenant relationship with God. It's as if we are eating bread together. Later in chapter 25, God commands them to make a lampstand of pure gold, the menorah. The menorah was to be lit every day, shining forth God's light continually, if you will. This continual light signified that it was from this location that humanity could commune with and learn the ways of the one true God. In this way, it makes total sense that Jesus would call himself the light of the world. Jesus' life shines as the perfect example of what it looks like when God's ways are lived out. And like the menorah, his entire life, including his death, serve as the signal to the world that it is through him that we can commune with and learn the ways of God. In chapter 26, we learn that God commanded them to make a veil which would serve as a partition between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. According to the book of Hebrews, the holy place served as a symbol for this age, whereas the Holy of Holies served as a symbol for the age to come. While Israel, through the priests, could commune with God every day in the holy place, it was only the high priest, once a year, that was able to commune with God in the Holy of Holies. And the writer to the Hebrews brilliantly taught how this relates to the animal sacrifices and to the sacrifice of the Messiah. The animal sacrifices brought atonement, but only for the moment. That they allowed you to have restored communion with God in that circumstance. However, according to the writer of Hebrews, the sacrifice of Jesus brings everlasting atonement. It is only the sacrifice of Jesus that allows us to have permanently restored relationship with God, allowing us to be given resurrection, immortality, and a place in the age to come. And according to the Gospels, when Jesus died, the veil that separates us from the age to come was torn in two, signifying that entrance into the age to come was now possible and indeed coming soon. In chapter 27, God commands them to build an altar for him. In the ancient world, the altar was understood to be the intersection between heaven and earth, between God and man. And the altar was the place on which the offerings would be made. It was the table on which God's food would be served. Once again, like the bread of the presence, this was another symbol of the fact that God and Israel would eat meals together, that they were in covenant relationship with one another. And again, Jesus symbolically serves the same purpose. Jesus is the one who is offered on the altar, so to speak, and through him we can have a part in that covenant relationship with God. For the rest of this week's Torah portion, God addressed the priesthood, Aaron and his sons. And in these chapters, God gave instructions regarding the priesthood's garments and how they were to be consecrated. Aaron and his sons were the God-ordained priesthood of Israel. As it says in chapter 29, they shall have the priesthood by a perpetual statute. Some Christians find themselves in contradiction with this verse when they teach that the sacrifice of Jesus and his subsequent priesthood in heaven abolishes the animal sacrifices and the Aaronic priesthood. However, a careful reading of Hebrews shows us that there is no contradiction. The animal sacrifices and the Aaronic priesthood are just like the other aspects of the tabernacle. They serve a genuine purpose, but they also point to Jesus and what he accomplished. The writer to the Hebrews puts it this way, firstly speaking of the Aaronic priesthood. He said, "The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer could cleanse people's bodies from ceremonial impurity. Now just think how much more the blood of Christ will purify our consciences from sinful deeds so that we can worship the living God." So the Aaronic priesthood and the animal sacrifices actually worked for specific circumstances in this age, especially related to ritual impurity. But it is only the sacrifice of Jesus which can permanently purify our consciences. The tabernacle, the Aaronic priesthood, and the animal sacrifices all point to Jesus, his sacrifice, and his priesthood, which allows us to have eternal life and a place in the age to come.